thanking the Hilton Foundation Board for the invitation to speak with you today and for organizing such a wonderful event for such an important award. I also want to thank those leaders who volunteered to assist with this selection of today's winners. Thank you for taking on this great responsibility with the world's largest annual humanitarian award for nonprofits that have made extraordinary contributions toward alleviating human suffering. Having started several nonprofit organizations over the last 20 years, I know how significant it is to win an award of this size and prominence. This is the type of recognition that will help SHAFCO leverage support from foundations and individual donors around the world. This is the type of support that will assist SHAFCO reach a scale of influence that I know will serve so many more people, organize so many more people to advocate for change on their own behalf. And SHAFCO, I want to thank you for your unceasing and relentless service to improve the quality of life for so many in Kibera, Kenya. Thank you for embodying the theme of this year's event, the future of humanitarian action, resetting our moral compass. You help us understand what the theme actually means. You embody the essence of the theme in the work you do every day. Thank you for staying true to your moral compass. In the mid-1800s, a Swiss businessman advocated for a form of national voluntary relief in the aftermath of a particularly bloody battle in Italy, which left 38,000 people wounded, dead, or dying. His ideas from the rubble of that war were turned into the International Committee of the Red Cross, which was founded in 1863. Hence the founding of humanitarian assistance as we know it. Since the late 1800s, humanitarian aid has grown around the world. Today, billions of dollars of relief is delivered by organizations throughout the world to those who are most in need. In today's world, change, constant change, is the one thing that is certain. The world around us is changing so rapidly and in so many different ways that we have sadly become accustomed to multiple humanitarian crises taking place simultaneously in different parts of the world. Some humanitarian crises are caused by men, some crises are because we ignore science, and some because we ignore the suffering of human beings until the suffering reaches crisis proportions. Our physical world is changing as we watch hurricanes and other natural disasters increase in frequency and intensity. Our political world is changing rapidly as we watch the historic movements of people across oceans and lands, people who embark on desperate journeys to escape conflicts or horrific political environments. The rapid spread of disease or widespread hunger has resulted in humanitarian crises, and even here at home, right in our city, one can argue that we all bear witness to a growing humanitarian crisis with tens of thousands of people without shelter, sleeping under our freeways every night. It is my hope that the future of humanitarian action involves the nations of the world coming together to prevent a crisis, or at the hint of a crisis, that we respond aggressively at the beginning in order to prevent the crisis from exploding, and then when it subsides, that the world stays together to address the root causes of a crisis to prevent a recurrence. The humanitarian crises that occur each year around the world and here at home from natural disasters are the type of crisis the world seems to be most empathetic, understanding, and supportive of. But resetting our moral compass when it comes to humanitarian efforts and natural disasters means we put out the fire, then fight for the policies needed to address the emergency. For example, I believe in this room we can easily reach agreement about the need to address the environmental reasons for the frequency and intensity of recent natural disasters. While we appropriately rush aid to address the emergency, the United States should rejoin the world stage and work together to implement policies urgently needed to address the warming of the planet and prevent future natural disasters that are certain to occur. Last year, as a result of political conflict and drought conditions, 3 countries at the same time were on the brink of famine. Although the crises were completely predictable, hundreds died before the world acted. When the Ebola crisis hit, 3 African countries When the Ebola crisis hit 3 African countries, the World Health Organization predicted the epidemic could wipe out up to 1 million people. The U.S. led the world's response by bringing together nations and organizing a massive effort that involved recruiting an entire healthcare workforce, constructing health clinics and hospitals, and training staff in how to treat patients while preventing exposure to the disease. Tragically, more than 10,000 people perished, but the lives of hundreds of thousands of people were saved. This is the type of leadership that I hope represents the future of humanitarian action. The reason the epidemic exploded was because the 3 nations did not have a strong health infrastructure. As we strive to reset our moral compass, it must include more than addressing the humanitarian crisis at hand. It must also include addressing the root cause of the crisis. So after the epidemic subsided, the efforts of the world should have focused on building the health infrastructure. Instead, the nations that came together and ended the crisis moved on. And now, unfortunately, Ebola is rearing its ugly head again in another nation. When it comes to humanitarian crises caused by conflict, the world responds quickly and then fades. The crisis does not subside, but the interest of the world in some cases seems to give up. The humanitarian crises currently taking place in Syria, Yemen, and South Sudan have not galvanized the world's support, perhaps because the crisis in these 3 nations never seems to end. But resetting our moral compass means we cannot afford to become fatigued. As the world stepped in and stomped out Ebola, the world needs to step up and demand an end to the conflicts and hold the nations accountable who are actively involved in the conflict, along with the nations that promote the conflicts behind the scenes through the sale of weapons that keep ruthless leaders in power. One of the greatest migrations in history have been taking place over the last several years as people in multiple parts of the world flee conflict, violence, hunger, and extreme poverty. Thousands of people from countries in the Middle East and Africa risk death from drowning in the Mediterranean Sea and the Indian Ocean. If they are lucky enough to survive the journey, they are now likely to face rejection and xenophobia when they reach the shores of European countries. Initially, many national leaders of European nations were sympathetic and welcomed the refugees with open arms until they began to experience the backlash from local officials and local communities. A backlash that in several instances almost toppled governments. A backlash that has brought to the surface new xenophobic and racist organizations and movements, fomenting fears the racial and ethnic makeup will fundamentally change the complexion of Europe. Although we all knew these horrible, hostile ideologies did not disappear, I don't think anyone ever expected national and international leaders to actively excuse, cover up, and essentially co-sign the hatred of these new movements. However, there is good news on the horizon. Many of the Africans who risked drowning in the Mediterranean Sea fled Eritrea. An unsettled conflict with Ethiopia provided the Eritrean government with an excuse to impose a repressive policy of forced conscription that could last a lifetime. This was the primary reason so many thousands of Eritreans left the country. But when Ethiopia chose a new leader this year, one of his first actions was to reach a peace agreement with Eritrea. It's not clear if forced conscription has ended, but the reason for it is gone. So now is the perfect time for the international community to step up and help both of these nations. Perhaps take the first few steps of inviting Eritrea back into the international community if they end this practice, and the international community can assist Ethiopia in maintaining the peace and help the new leadership integrate people who were disaffected from previous repressive leaders and conduct a process of reconciliation between ethnic groups and other factions. So hopefully the future of humanitarian action will include helping to mobilize the world to bring closure to conflicts that lead to humanitarian crises. All of the humanitarian crises I've discussed thus far are happening in other regions in the world. But right here at home in our nation, and I would argue in our city, we are in the midst of humanitarian crises as well. Of course, there are crises after natural disasters, and when there are disasters in most parts of the United States, we respond quickly and we respond well. Two examples where the response was not acceptable was Louisiana after Katrina and Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands after Hurricane Maria. The humanitarian crisis that has the world looking at us and questioning our moral compass is our response to the mass migration of children and families fleeing extreme violence and poverty in Central America. And as we sit here this afternoon, consideration is being given to using our military to close the US-Mexico border if a caravan of migrants from Central America is not stopped. The nation of Mexico is under threat that if they do not stop the dangerous caravan of mothers, fathers, and children making their way north, then our response to this humanitarian crisis will be to use our military to keep the desperate families from reaching our border. I don't even know what to say. Ironically, the problem of gang violence in Central America that is forcing people to risk their lives on the dangerous journey to the US, the gangs that terrorize families in Central America started right here in Los Angeles. Mara Salvatrucha, our MS-13, started right here. We deported the gang members and they started a reign of terror at home. So in my opinion, we are culpable. We contributed to this crisis and we should contribute to the solution. Instead, we have chosen to do something horrific. Instead of abiding by international treaties that call on nations to honor the request for asylum when desperate people show up on your borders or your shores, we are detaining the families and taking their children, and in many cases, shipping children off to other states and placing them in the care of community agencies or detention centers. The policy of separating families supposedly ended. However, family is being narrowly defined. When I visited a border internment camp, detention center, I spoke with a grandmother who was almost inconsolable. The grandchild she had cared for his entire life was taken from her and placed in another facility because family separation means a biological mother or father. A grandmother is not family enough. To make this tragedy even worse, we did not have a system in place that adequately tracked who the children were and where they were being placed. So do not fool yourself for 1 minute into thinking that we know how many children were taken from their families, or that we know where all the children are, or that we know where the parents are, especially those parents that were deported. The lucky ones who know where their children are told if you want your child back, you must pay the cost of 2 airline tickets, one for your child and one for a guardian who will bring your child home. Sometimes a humanitarian crisis is too narrowly defined. For example, the circumstances of homeless people we see under our freeways, living in their cars, or on our streets is not considered to be a humanitarian crisis if you subscribe to a strict definition or interpretation of a humanitarian crisis, which is defined as a singular or series of events that are threatening in terms of health, safety, or well-being of a community. A humanitarian crisis is typically viewed as something that happens suddenly, not over the course of several years. But the 20,000 to 30,000 people who live on our streets are there because of a series of failed policies and a heartless and ruthless housing market that, according to a member of the Los Angeles City Council, has led to our elders being the fastest growing sector of the homeless population. Our elders, senior citizens, are becoming homeless because they were tricked or swindled into signing over their homes or moving out of their rent-controlled apartments. So I ask everyone here to just take a moment and remember what you did the last time you stepped over a homeless person. Did you rally your neighbors to support the housing being built in your neighborhood? Or did you join in the lawsuit to block the homeless housing near you? Just take a moment to remember where you were when the children were taken away from their families as punishment and as a warning to others. Don't come here or you may never see your child again. Remember what you did to the humanitarian crisis on our border. Remember what action you personally took Technology has made the world so much smaller and made it so much easier to get involved that every single one of us can play a role. Every single one of us can respond to the humanitarian crisis right in front of us. So what are you personally willing to contribute to the future of humanitarian action? Resetting our moral compass means we are all personally responsible. And so I leave you to answer this question. How will you reset your moral compass? Thank you.